Hello, I'm back, and I'm here with Jeff from Stargazy.
Hi.
Who's here to talk to us about Democracy 3 Africa, which is on the show floor. You've been showing it to people over the last 2 days. How's your show been going so far?
Oh, it's been marvellous. It's so good to be able to get out of my coding cave, where I've been for the last 9 months, and get the game into people's hands. It's the first time it's been shown publicly since the development started, and really get good feedback about the game, how people are getting on with the interface, and even meeting people from the various countries that we're modelling here and getting their feedback on the political situations that we're modelling. It's really, really interesting.
So Democracy is a series, but not only is Africa a very different game, I also anticipate that a lot of people watching this maybe haven't played a Democracy game before or know sort of what you do or how you do it. So we've got the game here. We can maybe run through a few basics if we can get to the game.
Absolutely. So, Democracy as a series models the political, economic and social situations in various societies, and the way it does that is through quite a complex and nuanced simulation. But the actual interaction that you have with that sandbox, that political and economic sandbox, is policy decisions. So new policy, cancel policies, tweak policies, and it's up to you to govern through that interaction loop and to play around in that sandbox and build the society in a way that you want to see it built. And there's no right or wrong way of doing that. You just have to be able to get re-elected. So don't anger the electorate too much with what you're doing.
Previous Democracy games have, I think, or exclusively focused on sort of Western democracies.
Correct, yes.
Right? And forms of government that are relatively similar to one another in broad ways. This is a very different, from talking to you yesterday, this is a very different set of challenges from your perspective, but also for the player as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the diversity of the regimes that you find in continental Africa is so broad that the simulation has had to be added to be able to allow you to explore the alcoves of those political and economic situations that just aren't apparent in the Western democracies that have been modelled so far. So there are all sorts of additions to the simulation, such as stability, such as the implementation of democratic process that are taken for granted in the previous simulation, but needed to be modelled as a dimension inside of this simulation.
Before we go into more detail, why don't we fire up a campaign so people can see exactly how this manifests itself?
Yeah, so it's a fairly intimidating interface when you first load it up, so brace yourselves. But what we're going to do here is load up Mauritius. This is the African miracle, it's been dubbed. It's a very stable democracy. It's been an uninterrupted democracy since it started, and a very good, strong economy, moved away from agricultural produce to base its economy in services, which are very high yield and a good basis for an ongoing upward trend. So it's a great place to start as a beginner. You can customize the way that the simulation starts, but we're just going to use the basic configuration that the game comes with.
Notice your apathy slider there.
Yes, yeah, voter apathy is very important because, like I said, you only get to play the game as long as you can be re-elected. So if you can't rock the vote, yes, congratulations. 1.2 million people's lives are now in your hands. It's a small country, a small island nation off the east coast of Africa. So immediately when you see the interface, it's very overwhelming for somebody who's not played the game before. But what you've got to bear in mind is this is just an infographic. It's just communicating information to you so that you can make your interesting policy decisions. The way that you make policy decisions is with your political capital, which is indicated in a pool up in the top left. And with that, you're able to tweak your policy sliders here. So in this case, it's a policy that's already been implemented. It's the implementation of a police force, and you can adjust how much you're spending on your police force here. But you may choose that you want to implement new policies as well, and there are many categories and dozens and dozens of policies that are going to affect all aspects of your society and your economy. It's entirely up to you which way you want to go with them and where you want to start. But if we look at the UI as it is, everything in blue is a simulation value. So here we have a new simulation value for Democracy 3 Africa, a very important simulation value, which is infrastructure.
Right.
So being able to deliver your core services like education and health require you to be able to do so over a resilient infrastructure network, and that's just simply not the case in a lot of African countries.
For sure.
So everything in blue is a simulation value, and you can't impact directly. So I can have a look and see what's impacting my infrastructure, but there's no slider here, it's just in value. So the way that we actually implement change is through policies. So for instance, if we're over here having a quick look at maternity leave, not great in Mauritius. There's not a lot of maternity leave available for those who want it. Maybe it's something that you want to change, especially as the electorate who are represented in the centre here, 50% are women. This is a new voter group for Democracy 3 Africa, and is particularly important in this game because gender inequality is such a massive issue across all African states. It's also obviously an issue in the Western democracies that have been modelled previously, but the significance of the impact is much higher across Africa. So that's why the decision was made to add women. So we have simulation values that you can change with policies and situations that pop up as a result of the current state of the simulation. So green ones are good, so we're a highly stable society in Mauritius, which is driving the use of residential credit facilities and an active and lucrative stock exchange. So some things that if you were starting a game and you just wanted to come in and play it off the bat, you'd have a look at it and you've got two concerns perhaps. I want to fix negative situations that there are in the society, and I want to please the electorate because I only get to play on if I get re-elected. There's a timer here, so we have 12 turns, each turn's a quarter of a year until the next election, 12 turns. So at the moment I'm not very popular. The elderly love me, so we must have some decent state pensions, which I believe are contributing quite nicely here. Yep, state pensions, lovely. And the religious love me as well. Well, love's a strong word. They like me.
They quite like you.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So there are groups that I might focus on to try and activate the vote, because you can take the electorate who like you, and then if you can make them love you, then they will get out and they will vote for you, and that is how you win an election.
Pandering, you might call that.
Well, there's that, and there's a certain amount of cynicism as well. If you start messing around seriously with policy just before an election, then the cynical nature of that will be recognised by the electorate, and you won't get the bump that you were expecting. So if you're coming in and playing the game for the first time, you're probably looking at your electorate, seeing the composition of your electorate and who's happy with you and who's not, and trying to please them to get through the next election. And if you happen to fix a skills shortage in your country along the way, all the better. But like I say, it's a sandbox. You can play it any way you like. So you don't have to address the issues of your electorate. You don't even have to try and make them happy, especially not in Democracy 3 Africa, because in one of the ways that it fundamentally differs from the original simulation is that you can take it in an authoritarian direction as well. Because you don't have to have a functional state, you don't necessarily have to have a great implementation of democracy. It's possible to improve the lives of your electorate without using the machinations of democracy itself.
If you, I don't know, suspend or obstruct democracy, does that not change the fail state of the game if you can't be taken from power? So
you also have a problem with activists. So if you have a liberal base in the electorate inside your country and you're massively ramping down democratic process, press freedom, the freedom of thought and association, these sort of things are really going to anger your liberals, and they will militarize up. If you get them really angry, you'll have activists that become military faction activists, and then you suffer the risk of being assassinated. So you may not even get to the next election to be voted out if you're that extreme to warrant it.
see.
But there is a way of combating that. So if we look at your security here, the interesting thing about Mauritius is that it doesn't have a big military. Its armed police force doubles as its military, a very small military footprint. However, if you wanted to take it the way of an authoritarian regime, a wise thing to do would be to invest in security measures before you do, because then an assassination attempt may be made, but if your security is high, you'll be able to rebuff the attack.
Right.
So here, armed police is very low. We don't have a very large base of armed police. That's something that we might consider ramping up in order to deflect any assassination attempts, if we were going to go that way.
If you're going to suspend them.
Yes, of course. The other thing that is probably a more conventional way to approach a game like this is to come in and try and boost GDP, boost education levels, and make everybody a lot more happy. The interesting thing about Democracy Africa over the original game as well is that the stability of your country is going to change the demographic makeup as well. So you find that you have more conservatives in a less stable society where the economy is not good, and you have all sorts of other factors that contribute to your stability. If that's the case, then your stability is going to have an impact on all sorts of things, and it might be something that you want to focus on in turning it around.
How do you factor in corruption? So I believe that's actually new to this series, am I right?
It is, and you can see it's contributing to the stability here. So corruption is, it impacts all sorts of facets of life in the private and the public sector, and it's something that wasn't modeled in the original game, but really ought to be a consideration in any society. And the way that it works is that it can benefit you as a strong leader to have corruption in your society, because it means you'll be able to have more consolidated strength at the top to implement your will.
I see here it's driving up oil price.
Yes, in this case, every time a barrel of oil is produced, someone's taking a cut.
Right.
Yeah. And so the way you can reduce corruption, if you want to go that way, is to implement kind of progressive policies like a government code of conduct, or perhaps as something as obvious as a anti-corruption agency, that sort of thing. But taking an African nation that isn't modelled in Democracy 3 Africa, but is an interesting case in point, is there's an authoritarian regime in Rwanda. They have a lot of political goodwill behind them after coming to power, and they were able to make sweeping changes. And the president decided that corruption was something he wanted to eliminate in his society, and brought in some progressive economists to advise policy choices, and some of them made into the game. So something that you might not think about necessarily is open plan offices. So if you tear out
hide your email,
if you tear out all the walls inside of your government offices, there are fewer cubby holes for which backhand deals can go down.
So just get rid of the cubby holes.
Exactly. Yeah. There's nowhere to hide. Yeah.
In terms of, so you've had to simulate a real diversity of different states that work differently. And I'm presuming that when you begin a game as any one of these nations, their current situation is approximately true of their real policies and so on, and economic status?
Exactly. So although it's a single unified simulation that models all of these various mission starting points, the actual simulation or starting point for each country is modeled on real-world data. So over the development period, I'd say about half the development period has been deep research. So I realized that coming into this project that I had to start from a clean slate. My own perceptions of African sovereignties and Africa in general as a continent have been really heavily influenced by the lens of Western media, which tends to be quite sensationalist and sporadic in its coverage.
Right.
So I wanted to strip it all back and work from a clean slate and build the story of each country and parameterize each country with data, with the story that the data told. So I've built up this enormous amount of information that I call the mega matrix, which has got dozens and dozens of economic, political and social indicators in it that have been used to inform how the simulation needed to change for Democracy 3 Africa from Democracy, and also where those countries are going to start in the game space as parameterizing the simulation. So it was a data-driven design that was really important for me personally, so there's as much objectivity and realism imbued in the project as possible.
Given how data-driven it is, and I think maybe some previous Democracy games have encountered this issue in other ways, how do you prevent a player from gaming the system or from finding ways to, massage numbers to quote-unquote win? What winning means is really interesting when your game is about simulating actual society, but nonetheless.
Let's say that you decided that winning the game for you was to have the most GDP possible for your society. It's not an obvious path to getting that. Even as a developer, I would struggle to tell you the min-max configuration to lead you down that winning path that you've determined as your goal. The reason for that is because you can see the number of different inputs there are into the simulation and the number of elements of the simulation that are being modeled, and they all feed each other. So if I hover over various neurons, they're called, because it is a neural network of interactions, everything is impacting everything else, and although you can see the direct effect of a policy decision or a simulation on any other neuron in this way, the proxy effect on other neurons, the trickle-down effect, the butterfly effect across the entire simulation is too complex to fully understand the ramifications of any one individual decision.
So ultimately a player has to make the policy decisions they make based on what they understand about the world and economics and politics, not simply how different nodes or neurons interact with one another behind the scenes.
Ultimately, you're a politician, and you must work with the information that you're given, and I like a lot of politics. I think it's a lot of gut feel and not necessarily working with all the information at all times.
It's interesting you say that, because I was going to ask, you presumably, though, for the first time you're working with pretty good information, you're working with perfect information, which must interact with how the simulation of politics itself can function necessarily. Is there any way in which the data you're given here is incorrect? Misleading?
There is an obfuscation. So if you have a policy in the wild, you can imagine that you'd be using polls to find out what the impact is of that policy and how it's altering the society that it's in. But if you're selecting a policy for as a policy idea, you don't actually know what the impact is going to be until you've selected the policy. So there's a general feel for how popular it's going to be with the voters, with the electorate, but until you get it into the wild, you don't really know what the impact is going to be. You don't know what the cause and the effect is going to be.
Right. So you've had the Game On show here at the Weekender for 2 days now, or day and a half. It's such a deep thing. I can imagine this is the type of game someone will spend a weekend over sort of tugging at the different parts of the simulation.
Yeah.
What's it been like getting that to people in an environment like this, in a big hall full of games? What's the response been like?
It's actually been surprisingly good. Like I said, when you see the infographic UI for the first time, it can be quite intimidating. So anybody who's looked a little bit amused as they come past the stand, I've leapt out and grabbed them. So don't worry, it's only an infographic. The actual interaction loop is policy decision, and that's all you're doing is implementing policies, tweaking policies, and cancelling policies, and then people tend to get a bit more on board with it when you explain the blue values. You can't even interact with the blue values. They're just there to let you know how you're doing. So it's been really good, and I ramped down the amount of inertia there was in the system. So it takes a long time to implement some policies in real world, and that's modeled in the game. But so I've taken away a lot of that inertia, so that people can come and have a really interesting play experience in a show environment where you want to see the fruits of your labour within a very short time period. So that's helped as well.
So you've let people just sort of change something and then immediately see the havoc that they've wrought on.
Exactly. Yeah. So the volatility in the simulation is much higher in this show build.
How far along is the game now? Like, how close to completion in Sail?
We're getting pretty close. This is a demo with 7 of the 10 countries in it available to play at the show. We're still balancing, but we're pretty happy with the way that those 7 are feeling right now. And we're gunning for a March release. So by the end of the month, we would love to have it in people's hands.
Great. Jeff, thank you very much for joining me on the stream.
Well, thank you.